As I was preparing for the conversation with John Swinton you're about to hear, I was reminded of a quote from one of Jacques Ellul's first books, Presence in the Modern World, published in 1948. There, Ellul writes, quote, "We no longer know where we are heading. We have forgotten our common purposes. We have enormous means at our disposal, and we put into operation prodigious machines in order to arrive nowhere." 77 years later, Ellul's reflections remain accurate, and someone like John offers antidotes to this destructive aimlessness that ails many of us. In a world where power, speed, and wealth dangerously tend towards domination and movement towards no definitive end or ends, John gently and prophetically welcomes us into a world where kindness, contemplation, friendship, and slowing down are means that get us to the interrelated ends of loving God, neighbor, and self. As John puts it in his book, Finding Jesus in the Storm, The Spiritual Lives of Christians with Mental Health Challenges, quote, "Healing comes to us from God, but it also comes to us from other human beings. My kids often ask me what superpower I would like to have. I always tell them I'd like to have the power to be gentle and kind at all times. They just laugh and I can understand why, but I'm serious. Such a superpower seems rather weak in the face of the ability to fly or shoot spider webs from your wrists or scale tall buildings or defeat the powers of darkness while talking to your beautiful girlfriend on your state-of-the-art mobile. But I think my superpower, even though it's more an aspiration than a reality, is more interesting. Imagine a world where people didn't judge one another, a world where gentleness, kindness, and tenderness were our priorities. Within such a world, being different or seeing the world differently would not be an occasion for rejection, humiliation, demonization, and loneliness. Rather, such experiences would be seen as an opportunity to practice kindness. It seems to me that is precisely the superpower that is given to us by the Holy Spirit and is manifested so beautifully and movingly in the life of Jesus. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Matthew's Gospel, chapter 11, verse 29. Jesus is gentle. Wow. So that's a preview of what's to come in my conversation with John. But what you may not expect about what's ahead is that our conversation revolves around music as much as it does John's scholarly work. Because just as John is an accomplished writer and speaker, he's also a songwriter and singer, with the rock and roll history and his recently released album to prove it. The album is called Beautiful Songs About Difficult Things, and in that sense, its title represents a lot of the ground we cover in this conversation, and a lot of the ground that John covers in his work. And so with that, here's my conversation with John. So we're recording. John, thank you for joining me.
No, that's a pleasure.
It's wonderful to have you. As we always do, I want to start very simply and just ask, who is John Swinton? Which is a both simple and complex question, but maybe share a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's a very good question, Michael, because I'm looking at my reflection in this camera, and I'm in the process of growing a beard, but I'm shaving it off, so I'm not quite sure who I am when I
Yeah.
look at myself there. So that probably reflects a lot of my life. But who I am is professionally, I'm a professor in practical theology at University of Aberdeen in Scotland. I've been here for a long time. I've been here for about 25 years. My areas of interest are mental health, disability, and in particular dementia, for a number of reasons, just because they're really important theological and cultural issues. In my real life, my domestic life, I'm married to Alison, my wife, and we have 5 kids. All of whom have just moved. Well, my youngest daughter moved out not so long ago. So, for the first time in a long time, we're trying to work out what it means to be empty nesters and have to decide whether or not we like each other or not. And so, the jury's out. We'll see.
Yeah. I was gonna say, how's that going?
It's going fine.
I bet. Well, I mean, there's so much that we can talk about given how much you've written and all the work that you have done. And so we made this space to have a conversation, I was like, how should we how should we approach this conversation? And I thought, well, you just recorded an album, and listening to it, reading the lyrics and so on, I thought, well, what if we we got at John's work by looking at the songs and seeing where that goes? So before we get into that, I want to know, when did you first listen to a song or see somebody perform, or when did the idea enter your mind? Hey, maybe I could do this. Pick up guitar, start singing. When did that moment happen? Because for most musicians and songwriters, there's a moment or moments when they
Yeah.
realize, hey, maybe I can do that.
Well, I think I got my first guitar when I was probably about 14. I mean, I'd always been into music and stuff, but when I was 14, I bought a guitar, a very cheap nylon string guitar, and I used to either play it or certainly make some interesting noises out of it. But that's when I really began to not think of myself as a musician, but it's definitely when the beginning of my love for uh, producing music began. And I played in bands for years and years, in pubs and clubs and stadiums and all sorts of places like. So for most of my younger life, I actually wanted to be a rock and roll star. And so it was funny because I played for this band called Grey by the Gun, and it was quite a good band, Scottish band. And when I left that band, I, I got a contract with Virgin Records down in London, who were then managed by a guy called Miles Copeland, who's Stuart Copeland's brother from the Police. Anyway, that's by the way. And so I did some recording with them, and then they ran out of money, and so they had a list of new artists, and they put a line through the list of new artists, and I was below the line. And then I did the same thing with EMI, and so I did some recording with them, and then they had a list of new artists, and they put a line through it, and I was below the list. So I kind of got disenfranchised from music for a little while, but then I later on in life I began to realize that all these times when I was playing in pubs and clubs and stadiums and all these things, I thought I was trying to be a rock and roll star, and I was trying to be a rock and roll star, but God had other plans. And so my musical talents were used ultimately for leading worship, for writing songs, and for helping people to think through issues. The confidence that I gained through doing all of these things helps me to be a lecturer, a speaker, or a preacher. And so, oddly enough, even though I was aiming for something else, God was forming me for different reasons. Like, it's just quite interesting looking back.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my experience is similar actually, as somebody who's ended up in teaching. Is I grew up not formally trained in music, but my father played bass in a R&B and soul band, and he kept his bass
Oh,
guitar. And the first instrument that I learned to play music on was a Rickenbacker 4003,
oh, really? Nice.
72 era, just like
Yeah,
Chris Squire from Yes
sure.
played. And so talk about a first instrument. Like nobody forgets their first instrument, but I think I started out pretty well.
That's
Uh,
a
uh,
high bar.
and very similarly, I wanted to be a punk rock star. That was what I wanted to be,
Right.
because not being formally trained, punk music was pretty much all I could learn, and it was loud, it was aggressive, it was kind
Uh,
of just goofy, and teenage Michael really responded to that. But I look back, I definitely did not, you know, hang out with Stuart Copeland's brother. I definitely did not
I'll give it
work with
that.
Virgin or EMI, but I did college bands, all that performing, and you wouldn't necessarily know it, but so much of what I learned in those contexts go
Yeah,
into what I do now. And
yeah.
actually, theater in high school
Oh,
was
really?
huge. Yeah. I mean,
That's interesting.
improv. One of my favorite books to use in Christian ethics course I do is Sam
Uh,
Wells'
oh,
Improvisation,
yeah, yes, yes.
because so much of life, as Shakespeare wisely said, is performance,
Yeah, yeah,
and you can't really get out of it. So, as a teacher, you're always having to work with people, go in there, and there's the expectation, like, engage me, entertain
yes,
me. And what do you
yeah,
do with those expectations?
yeah.
And I tell you, if you've got used to playing in pubs with, five, six other bands going on at 1 a.m. in the morning and nobody cares,
That's
if you
right.
can engage that audience, you can
That's
engage
right.
a bored student,
That's
right?
that's so true. That's,
So, yeah.
yeah.
Oh man. Well, that's interesting.
It's good to know you're a fellow sinner.
Yeah. Yes. Well,
Yes,
grace means all the more,
exactly.
right? So, so I want to get into the album, but you talked about sort of you were on this trajectory. You wanted to be the rock star, and you dabbled in that for a while, but it ultimately, you didn't make it past that new artist line. And before you got into academia, there was your work in chaplaincy and psychiatric nursing. So, at what point did you sort of feel led into that territory, which is kind of the sort of bridge from rock star,
Yeah.
spiritual care to where you are now? So, at what point did you put down the guitar for a little bit and say, "Hey, I'm going to do this"?
Well, they were all happening together.
Mm,
They all eventually merged into the same journey. And in relation to, well, I nursed for 16 years, and people often ask me, how did you get called into nursing? And I didn't really get called into nursing. I was unemployed when I had been left school for a year. I was 17 or something, maybe 18. And I was looking for something to do. And my friend became a nurse. He said he became a psychiatric nurse. So I thought, oh no, that's what I'll do. I'll become a psychiatric nurse. And it turned out that was exactly the right thing. I really did enjoy it. But it wasn't because I had a kind of epiphany saying, this is your vocation. But it turns out it was my vocation. And oddly enough, so I nursed for that length of time, and then people then ask me, how did you end up in ministry in the academy? And again, there's no epiphany. It's just like I still enjoy my nursing, but I knew it was time to change. So I left and began to study for what I thought then was for ordination, because I thought I'd end up in chaplaincy, because there's a natural progression from nursing to chaplaincy. And I did end up getting ordained in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. But as soon as I got to university, I knew that my vocation was practical theology. I just knew that straight away. And I'm not a vocation person, but I just knew that was the right thing for me. So I finished my degree and then I did a PhD. I got a job down in Glasgow. And 3 weeks after I got my job in Glasgow, a job came up in Aberdeen. And so I applied for that and got that. So my colleagues in Glasgow were very gracious, but I imagine they had plenty to say behind my back. And I came up to Aberdeen, and again, I knew this was the right place for me. I was living in Aberdeen, so it's not that I came up, I came back up to Aberdeen. And that was it. So the only overt vocational call I had was that I knew that I was to teach practical theology. Everything else in my mind is a coincidence, but in God's mind, I'm sure it's not. So the only epiphany I had was, this is a space for you.
yeah. I mean, this is my motto, as it were. 70% of success in life is showing up. The other
Yeah,
30% is hard work and kindness, and God takes
yeah,
care of the rest.
yeah,
And then as you do that retroactively, you find yourself in a place, and you look back and there's the epiphany, and you can say, "Oh,
that's
this was
right.
happening all along." But you know,
It's
a lot of
exactly right.
times it's just showing up, putting in the work, and being kind as you do it. And I know kindness is a theme in your work. So moving to the album,
Oh,
how did
yes.
this come about? Like, it's been in the works for a while. So at what point did you say, I'm going to start working on this? Or was it just
Yeah.
you pick up the guitar, one song, and the next thing you know, it's just right? Or how did that come about?
No, I mean, I've been writing songs for years. So I've always been writing the songs. And even when I left the bands and formally left the music business, I still wrote songs. So I was still into it. But how the album came about is kind of strange. So I was invited to speak on a podcast called Family 360. And one of the podcast hosts was a guy called Roy Salmon, who is a music producer. And so, right at the beginning of the podcast, we had a conversation similar to this. And I noticed that behind him there was a row of guitars. And so we had a real conversation about guitars and music and what have you like it. And then we did the podcast. And then I spoke to him after that when I came back across to Vancouver. At that time, he had a charitable arm to his business that was looking to encourage people who wouldn't normally record stuff to record stuff. So I joined him for that. So Roy and I initially we did 2 or 3 songs. Just the plan was to do one song and just see, for a bit of fun. But once we got into a couple of them, we realised it was probably something important here. And so because I was teaching at Regent, I was backwards and forwards quite a few times to Vancouver. And so every time I came across, I recorded some part of a song or a whole of a song with Roy, and then come back home again. And so over a period of 2 years, we ended up with the album. Well, actually, that's not. We ended up with a bunch of songs. And of course, in typical muso fashion, I decided I didn't like half of them. So I wrote a whole new set of songs. And and then, long story short, Roy came across to Aberdeen, spent some time here, and we recorded these new songs in my office. Not this office. This is my office at work, but my office at home. And that was where the album finally came properly to life. So Vancouver, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the other thing about creativity. I think that a lot of times there's this feeling that if it doesn't make it into the final product, whatever that is, if it's an essay, if it's a book, if it's an album, that somehow it's a loss.
No,
And over time, I've learned that actually it's not a loss if nobody ever sees it, because maybe that was what you needed to go through to get to the thing that you do end up sharing,
that's right.
right?
And yeah,
Yeah.
no idea is ever wasted. So I just think I'm fascinated by the creative process, right? That whether you're a writer, a theologian, a musician, wherever you are, you sit down, wherever you are, and you write a song, for example, and then 20 minutes later, or 3 months later, depending on how quickly you write, there's something new that's in the world that wasn't there before. And then it goes into the world and it changes people. It makes a difference in the world. You've no control over that. Like. And yes, there are certain songs that never make the cut, but you can be guaranteed that the learning process that went into that song, or parts of that song, or parts of these melodies will come in somewhere else, and then they'll go back out into the world and they'll do something beautiful. And so nothing's ever wasted.
Yeah. And I think that really captures actually like the overarching theme of the album, which is called Beautiful Songs About Difficult Things. And I mean, when I saw that title, I was like, wow, this is one way to frame actually a large portion, if not the majority of the work that you do as a scholar, right, as a
Yeah,
practical theologian. So yeah, things go out, they come back in, and there's this process of transformation where even the most difficult things are transformed into something
that's right.
beautiful,
That's
and
right.
and a reflection of a God who is with us, who is transforming difficult things
Mhm.
into beautiful things in songs.
Well, it's funny
So
because I was at a dinner not so long ago, and um, somebody was asking me what the album was called, and for some reason I couldn't remember. I said, "Yeah, it's called Difficult Songs About Beautiful Things." He says, "What? Is it jazz?"
or were you listening to Nick Cave at the time? Yeah, you were that's the B-sides, it's like the moody
The shadow side. That's right.
freeform jazz, postmodern, avant-garde.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I anticipate the release of that. So jumping into the songs, the first track is called Dancing with the Spirit, and I just want to pull some lyrics from this and then comment on them and see what your thoughts are as I comment on this. So it says, I have a vision. Heaven's grace is drawing near. I'm looking towards a future where there are no goodbyes. So I sense that there's a sadness in these lyrics. I mean, the title is pretty open that this album is about difficult things, and there's a sort of thread of sadness that sort of runs throughout the album. But for someone listening, um, you tend to say, okay, well, if this is a core theme of the album and all the songs, there's there's likely a loss or losses that have happened at some point. And I know that loss and grief and
Hmm.
suffering are very prominent themes in your work. So can you speak about loss and goodbyes and the ways that it has shaped your work and your ministry?
Yeah, well, I mean, the song itself is exactly as you describe it. It's about that mystery that, this world is full of suffering and loss, but we still have hope. And that one day that hope. And for now, the best that we can do is dance with the Spirit, and the Spirit gives us hope. And it's about that idea of, a sense of homefulness. Paul says that your home is in heaven, but your home is here now. And but grief and loss causes a sense of homelessness. And so dancing with the Spirit brings you back home and gives you that here now, but gives you that possibility for the future. And has it shaped me? I've never sat down and thought about that, Michael. I mean, I, like everybody else, have had a lot of loss in my life. People I love have gone, and people that I've loved have gone sometimes in tragic circumstances. So I don't have an illusion that life is somehow beautiful, and that, well, I think life is beautiful, but somehow the gospel calls us to escape from the suffering of life. I don't think that that's the case. I don't know how you could have a cross-centered faith and think that suffering has nothing to do with you. It's all to do with Jesus, or whatever you want. So I think it's ingrained within us that suffering is here. Now, we don't know why, and you're best not to speculate. But what we do know is that we have a hope for the future. But that hope for the future doesn't prevent the fact that we lament in the present. So it's not an escapist hope for the future. It's a hope for the future that includes suffering. It's like the biblical idea of joy is a good example. When Paul in Galatians talks about the fruits of the Spirit, he doesn't name happiness. What he names is joy. And joy is a concept that includes the possibility of happiness, but it also includes the possibility of suffering. And ultimately, what joy is Jesus. You find your joy in Jesus, and irrespective of where you are. And that's not to mean you're happy irrespective of where you are, or even you celebrate irrespective of where you are. But it does mean you have that reassurance that however difficult things are, Jesus sticks with you. And the song pushes us to remember that and to openly remember the friends that we've lost, and in the light of the hope that's given to us.
Yeah. I mean, your response there reminds me of your book, Raging with Compassion, and your engagement with the classical question of the problem of evil and suffering, and
Yeah.
the way that you disengage from the classic or typical ways
Hmm.
of of probing that question. And you know, as you point out, like when tragic things happen, we want an explanation why. That's a
Hmm.
pretty inherent reaction to tragedy. Um, and there's some answers to that question offered by scripture, but not a ton. Like
No.
beyond Genesis 3 saying, we're subject to sin and death, and there's a fracture that happens in creation, and just how deep that goes is something that theologians will continue to talk about until Jesus comes back. Um, Beyond that, we don't get a lengthy
Yeah.
explanation, and the book of Job is a cautionary tale on that.
Indeed.
And you make the practical move, just like you did in your response, to say, actually, Bible doesn't say a lot about why, but it says a lot about how to live in
Yeah,
the reality of suffering that will come. We don't need to go looking for it. It'll
no,
come. And God doesn't lie to us and say it's not. He's
no,
pretty honest about it. And
no.
what the cross shows us is that we're not abandoned to
That's
ourselves in
right.
that, right? And how do you live in the uncertainty of that? How do you move forward with Jesus and other people when you want that explanation why and you don't get it, and you
Yeah,
want to give up, and there's a God that is there that says, "I'm still here," right?
that's right.
Yeah. And
And I think,
how do you and then from there, how do you learn to dance in the spirit, in
uh,
joy? That's the next step.
people in various cultures dance at funerals. So the embodiment of movement is actually part of the process of grief and lamentation. It may not be where we are, but it is in many other places. So dancing has a particular meaning across cultures. But there's two things it's in response to what you just said. The first one is Jesus doesn't abandon us, but Jesus understands what it feels like to be abandoned. The cry of dereliction is all about feeling disconnected. It's not a cry of a loss of faith, but it's a cry of disconnection and abandonment. So if we do feel that we are abandoned, then we may struggle to find the Father, but we can find Jesus in the midst of our abandonment. But the second thing I will say, the book of Job's interesting because sometimes people use it as an explanation for suffering. Of course, you would have to then say suffering is caused by God's gambling habits, which is never a great look.
Yeah, it doesn't work well for anybody.
No, it's not a great comforter. But I'm always fascinated by the way that the book of Job ends. And Gustavo Gutierrez, Liberation Theology, in his commentary on Job, he points out that Job ends in contemplation. He's learned that he has to love God simply for God's sake. Not for what God can do for him, not for what he might want from here or here, just learning to love God for God's sake, which is what the contemplators try to do through all the spiritual practices and going out into the deserts and the hills to get away from their intellect and just learn how to love God. And that's a really hard thing to do because if we examine our own spirituality, very often a central part of it is asking God to do things for us. But Job's conclusion was we just need to learn to love God.
Yeah. One of the books that I really love on this is James Cone's Spirituals and the Blues.
Oh, yes.
And very similar territory to Gutierrez. And in one chapter, he works through Habakkuk and Job and says they want an explanation for why this happens, and instead they get a revelation.
Mm,
And Habakkuk is told, see and write it down and go tell people. And then Job says, I have heard of you, but now I see you.
yes.
And I was like, wow, yes, yes. And um, William Blake did illustrations of the book of Job, and the way that he renders Job's sight of God in that moment. And Job's wife is right beside him. And it's really cool. Job's wife is with him in all the illustrations
Yeah.
that Job appears. But Cohn's point is that we don't get an explanation even in the most like brutal instances of suffering, but we do get a revelation of divine presence.
Yeah.
And and sometimes that's still shattering, but how do we trust that God is there and move forward, uh you know uh and then this makes me think is like, wow, somebody needs to do, if it's not already done yet, a biblical theology of the sight of God. Is that, do those who see God, is it mostly in instances of intense tragedy and suffering, you know
Mm,
um So moving to another theme in your work, the song "Beautiful" um, pulls us in a bit of a different direction, where you say Emma looks a little different. When she talks, her voice sounds like mystery. But if you listen, you can feel her heart. And there's some that want to heal her. Why can't they see what I see? So lyrics like these capture so much of the heart of your work in writing and in practice. So if you don't mind sharing, like, who is Emma and what for you is going on theologically and practically speaking in lyrics like these and work that is
Sure.
operating within this territory.
Well, Emma's not Emma, if you see. I mean, Emma is just a name for somebody. Um,
Mm,
so, so but Emma represents a friend of mine who lives with cerebral palsy and very devoted Christian. And once upon a time, she went to a local church, and it was a healing service, and she went forward for healing. Now, the reason she went forward for healing is because she has back problems. But immediately the pastor started trying to cast demons out of her life. And so she left and she was really upset. I mean, she's fine now. She's in a good congregation that kind of sees her for who she is. But it just struck me that, people who make judgments, be that spiritual judgments or social or psychological judgments, without knowing people, are dangerous, to be perfectly frank. Like, and the line after that you didn't read there was, you are beloved. Why can't you see what I see? You are beloved. And that's it. I mean, that's the bottom line. It's not what we look like or what we think or what we know or what we don't know. It's the fact that we're beloved. And we recognize that we come from love and we ultimately will return from love. And I think, when it comes to issues around normality, I mean, I was writing an essay on creation and disability for a reader that came out not so long ago, um, or a textbook it was. And one of the things that struck me is um, Genesis doesn't say anything about what Adam or Eve looked like. Now you could say, well, he walked in the garden, but walking has all sorts of connotations. It could all mean anything at all. So we have no real understanding of what so-called normal or so-called original human beings looked like, right? But what we tend to do is project onto people who appear to be different our fantasies about what we'll look like when we get to heaven. Like, so, if I get to heaven, you couldn't possibly look like you. And the subtext being, you'll probably look a bit more like me. But you've no idea what you look like in heaven. But Paul says, 1 Corinthians 15, he says, the resurrection body, he doesn't say the resurrection body is replaced. He says it's transformed. In other words, something of all of our bodies that we have just now, some kind of durability, but we have no idea which parts of them are, and we have no idea what will be transformed, only that it will be transformed. So it's real arrogance for us to turn around and just say to somebody like Emma, because you look like this must be the reason for it. Again, it's back to this explaining evil or explaining suffering, and as soon as you start to explain it, you make it worse. And that's a good example. This woman has a medical condition, wants her back fixed. This guy has this kind of spiritual explanation of what it is, and then he just makes her life worse. Um, uh, so yeah, so it's that line, you are beloved, I think is the key, like, and recognizing that none of us know what perfection is. None of us know what we look like in heaven and the eschaton. So let's get on and love one another as we are just now.
Yeah.
Leave the transformation to God.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an element of your work that there's a thoughtfulness, there's a kindness, there's a compassion there, there's empathy, and yet fueling a lot of that is advocacy and um perhaps even anger, frustration, confusion. Can you share a little bit about that? Because just, personally speaking, I find that I'm drawn theologically to, the places that are on the margins or the people that are pushed to the side. And, you can hide behind in that the work, but often, as it's been rightly said, all theology is confession, right? And so where for you does this sort of fire really get lit and burn for you? Like the protest against this ideal of normalcy, and what does it do, and who it harms, who it excludes? Like, where did that fire start burning for you?
Well, you say advocacy. I mean, I am interested in advocating, but I'm also very interested in people advocating for themselves,
Yeah.
as long as they can. But see, because of my places of formation, working with people with severe mental health challenges or people with profound intellectual disabilities, because I retrained and worked in that field for a while, people there are very often can't advocate. Certainly people with profound intellectual disabilities can't advocate. People with advanced dementia can't advocate. So in that sense, they do need people who will hold their stories in the midst of. But I just think, I see it in the politics of the moment, that we've forgotten the power of the Beatitudes. We've forgotten the significance of the weak and the meaningless in society's eyes. We've forgotten that Paul didn't get healed of his thorn in his flesh, whatever that was, but instead found that, that his calling was in his gentleness, his vulnerability, his brokenness. And that's the space where he found God. We seem to have forgotten all of that. And one of the things that strikes me when I read the Gospels, oftentimes we say, Jesus sat with the marginalized. I'm thinking, no, that's not right. He didn't sit with the marginalized. He sat with those whom religious and social society marginalized, but over there, religious people were just doing their own thing. And over here, on the so-called margins, Jesus, God, is doing something different. So he doesn't sit in the margins, he shifts the margins. And the thing that troubles me sometimes about all of us is that we don't spend enough time recognizing that we're supposed to be on the margins. We're supposed to be living in the margins, at least in society's eyes, because it's in the margins, in the marginal places that we find God. So I think probably the Beatitudes are one of the most powerful things. There's a lot of talk just now about Christianity in the public square, and there's no talk about the Beatitudes.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is just it, John. Like I happen to be a part of a tradition that says we're all about the, inerrancy and authority of the word of God. But then you look at what's going on these days and you're like, well, for a tradition that says that, you don't actually seem to read it a lot,
That's right.
Like, you can't even get through like the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount and get here. Like Matthew 25 is there, or like even Paul, right? Like everybody not everybody, but it's a common move to make Paul this like superhuman apologist, swashbuckling,
That's right.
grab people by the throat type of guy. And yeah, he wrote pretty fiercely, but then he shows up and people are like, this is the guy, you
Exactly.
know? And so it's just hidden in plain sight. Like you said, that yeah, from one perspective, the margins are the margins, but then God shows up and says, actually, I'm pushing the margins, and this is where the quote unquote action is at. This is where the kingdom is at. And so how do we invite people in? I suppose is the challenge and the opportunity and the joy sometimes.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean it's a radical reframing of what's important, what is not, what is marginal, what is not. Absolutely. And it's like I say, it's hidden in plain sight. Um,
That's
so you mentioned creation, and one of your songs is written like a lament for creation. So you talk about the skies are sighing, the seas are sobbing, the land's lamenting, I'm crying with you. Uh, can you share a little bit about that interest in
right.
your work and what you're up to in a song like that?
Yeah, well, I just finished a book which is based on a lecture series I did in Baylor last year, and I was looking at the concept of shalom, and I always speak about shalom. I did my PhD on shalom and schizophrenia, and it's been haunting me ever since. But one of the things about the concept of shalom is it's peace, peace within yourself, peace between others, peace with creation, and peace with God. Any disruption in any of these dimensions is bad for people, you know. And so in that book, I'm pushing to say that mental health and creation are deeply connected, because one of the new diagnoses, in inverted commas, is eco-anxiety. People, particularly young people, who are becoming really, really anxious about the environment. And the thing that's exacerbating their anxiety is the fact that politicians and business people, the people who adults who should be looking after them and protecting them, are just not.
Mhm.
And so they're feeling, and every day they're faced with the news and talk about climate change, and so they become anxious, become depressed. So it's like a contemporary new mode of anxiety, and that's because we've forgotten that the land is not a commodity. The land is a gift, within which we are, as you see in Genesis, to care and tend for the land. Such a beautiful thing. You know, you've got these two images, one in the first creation account where God gives dominion over the world, you know, control it, crush it down, and we all love that. But then the second creation account is just care and tend for the world. And there's something beautiful about that, you know, to care for, and tend for the world. You care and tend for people, but do you care and tend for life? If you're a farmer, I'm sure you know exactly what that meant. But most of us, particularly of us who are urban dwellers, it's an alien concept, but it's a
Yeah.
really powerful one. So that song is about, well, it's called Dust and Ashes, and that's what worries me. We're turning everything into dust and ashes.
Mm.
And we need to lament for what we're doing. And lament means recognition and transformation. Not just recognition, this is awful, but transformation. We need to do something.
Mm. One of the things that I think about a lot is in the creation accounts, like we are revealed to be made from the dust of the ground
I
or
know
the
it's
soil of the
amazing.
ground or
Terra
the
animata.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And so if that's the case, we come from the ground and we go back to the ground.
Yeah.
Uh and yet so much, like you just pointed out, are urban dwellers. So we're actually alienated from the very thing from which we are created. And of course,
Hmm.
we are more than soil or dirt. We also have the breath of God breathed into us, but we still are made from the ground. And so I think a lot about how the way in which we view the soil actually reflects analogically the way that we view ourselves. That
Hmm.
those things are very interconnected, right? And so yes, we view it as something to be sort of manipulated, harnessed, commodified, and so on.
Hmm.
And that's quite a cheap view of the ground and the gift of creation. And lo and behold, it seems to me that we also have a pretty cheap view of what it is that a person is, or a limited view of what
Hmm.
the person
Hmm.
is. And what does it mean to rediscover those connections between creation, ourselves, and God? And hopefully, in rediscovering those connections, discover a new hope. How does relationship and friendship fit into this? Because I know this is a critical piece of your work as well. In a world with such dread, anxiety, isolation, right? I teach undergrads and we talk about eco dread. And
Hmm.
I read the sort of research on it and I say, do you know people that are struggling with this? Like, do you know people who are saying, I I'm not only wrestling with despair, but I don't see the point of starting a family and raising kids, given what's
Yeah.
happening in our earth. So how does relationship and friendship specifically help us negotiate some of these really precarious situations that we find ourselves in?
Well, I think you have to begin somewhere. Like every journey and every transformation, it begins somewhere. And friendship is a very good place to begin. You know, and kindness is a very good place to begin. I've been doing a little bit of work recently with Julian of Norwich.
Hmm.
And she's interesting because at one point in her revelations, she says, God is kind. Right? So it seems like a very nice and obvious thing. But in Middle English, which she would have written in, or she did write in, Kindness has a multitude of different meanings. So it means being nice to people, generous, etc., etc. But it also means being of the same kind. So when she says God is kind, she's talking about the kind of God God is. And then she says, in the resurrection, Jesus becomes our kind. And so in Jesus, we become kin. We become
Mm,
brothers and sisters, like.
mm,
And the mode of that kinship is the relationship of friendship. And so God is kind, Jesus is our kind, and so therefore kindness is the essence of what it means to be a disciple. And there's something very powerful about that, I think, because the kinds of friendships that Jesus had were quite radical, right? So our friendships are quite mathematical. If you give me the enough social goods or relational goods or spiritual goods, I'll stay with you. I'll stay your friend. If you don't, then I'll find another friend. Right. So basically, like attracts like is the way we go. And you can see that in your Facebook feed or whatever social media. You get rid of everybody you don't like, and you get this little echo chamber of the people that you do, which is the exact
yes.
opposite of Jesus. So the principle of the incarnation is that God, who is radically unlike human beings, becomes a human being and offers friendship to the disciples and then ultimately to everybody. So when Jesus says in John's Gospel, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends, the nature of discipleship shifts to friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And the friendship for Jesus was always for the outsider. God, who is radically unlike everybody, becomes friends of the outsider. Friends of everybody, but particularly outsiders for whatever reason. You need to ask God why that is. But it's not to say that only poor people can be Christians, but it seems to me that Jesus locates himself socially in a particular way that we have to take notice of. And the way that the relationship he uses to do that is friendship.
Mm, mhm.
And once you realize that you're connected to one another in that way, and that the body of Christ is not a metaphor, then you begin to see that your responsibility is for the environment in which your friends live.
Yeah.
You can't just be friends and then ignore the economics of the day or ignore the fact that people are unemployed. That's not what friends do. Friends care about these things. Like,
Yeah.
and so friendship, once you understand it, does cycle out into these other issues. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And we've talked about the Beatitudes, we've talked about I mentioned Matthew 25. And one of the things that occurred to me is precisely what you're saying here is Jesus says, I was the prisoner, you visited me, or you didn't, right? I was the widow, I was the sojourner, I was the orphan, so on and so on. And in our hyper individualized sort of North American world and and more sort of more broadly the West, we just tend to focus on the individuals in that equation. But then I realized I'm like, there's an environmental factor to it, right? So it's the individual who is located in a prison with a whole bunch of other people and a whole complex. And so this is the radicality of friendship, is that if you go there, and hopefully you do because Jesus says he's there, and you spend enough time to become friends with those who are there, it's not just like you're friends with that person and you're totally dissociated from your
yeah,
environment. You become attuned to that environment in a way that you weren't before, and then
that's right. That's
that
good.
is the perfect location for something radical to happen.
Mhm.
Um, but it took me a long time to get there, to that sort of context where I'm like, oh, that's what he's doing, right? Or the widow or the sojourner, right? Like how difficult, and I realize this, um, how difficult our society can make it for us to go to that space. So
Yes.
having done prison ministry before, the amount of bureaucracy one has to go through, even for somebody such as myself,
Yeah.
who is as sort of boring and as middle class as you can get at this point,
I
no
had noticed that.
record. Yeah, you noticed I'm boring and middle class. Thank you.
Not for you
But
to
no,
pass judgment on that.
I remember like going through the process of that, like, oh, yes, you photocopied your identification, but it needs to be color, it can't be black and white. You need this form, not that form. And I just thought, wow, this bureaucracy connects to principalities and powers that don't want me to go see Jesus in prison,
Yeah.
right? Or you think about, the way that, you know, migrants are treated today. And, even if people want to go and connect and care and make friends, how difficult it can be, which isn't an excuse not to do it, but it's just pointing out that we think about things like friendship and say, oh, that's not, what's friendship, right? Give me power, give me wealth, give me a political position and I'll make change. And Jesus says, actually, I'm going to change things through friendship,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly.
Um,
And people will say, give me power, give me money, I'll change things. But the problem is power and money changes people. So, you may be right, you probably could change things, but you may find yourself changed in ways that you don't want to be changed.
oh, 100%. And this is what I've learned from reading Ellul is everybody thinks they're going to be the exception to that rule.
Right.
Like I'm going to be the one person who
In history.
who isn't warped, I'm gonna be the one person who bows down to this idol, but like, uses it for the kingdom. It's like, you're not that strong. Like, stronger people have gone before you and stronger people come after you, but it warps you. And, especially for somebody born in middle class like me, I mean, my will,
Right?
if you offer me a little, so yeah, it's just like, watch out.
Yeah.
I have two more questions. One serious and then one kind of goofy. But the more serious one is about speed. And you've talked about this in your work before, but you have a song called 3 Mile an Hour God,
Yes.
or three miles an hour. But that's a reference to a book called 3 Mile an Hour God. So talk a little bit about the theme of time and speed in your work and how that's playing into this conversation as well.
Yeah, the book that you're talking about is by a Japanese theologian called Kasuka Kiyama. And in it, the essence of it is, or at least the essay in that book is, the average speed that a human being walks at is 3 miles per hour. So Jesus, who is God, walks at 3 miles per hour. Jesus, who is God, who is love, walks at 3 miles per hour. Love has a speed, and it's a slow speed. Um, and the power of that is that, well, people in New York walk faster than anywhere in the world. I was reading this book called The Geography of Time. The place to go if you want to walk slowly is Guatemala, apparently. So the people walk slowly in Guatemala. But the speed that you walk indicates something of the priorities where you are. But the problem is when you're walking quickly and when you're always moving on to the next thing, the person in front of you begins to disappear. And when you're surrounded by or avoidant of slow people, then they get forgotten. And so, people with advanced dementia, you have to be slow. You have to be patient. You have to be kind. You have to be watching for the possibility of connection, which is oftentimes there. People with profound intellectual disabilities, you've got to be slow. You've got to just take your time and realize that you have a significant disability here because you can't understand what's going on here. And not say, well, they have, because you're so used to using words and so used to speed that you can't slow down. Um, and I just think that in order to do the kinds of things that Jesus calls us to do in the Beatitudes and elsewhere, then we need to change our concept of what time is. Because we buy time, we use time, we waste time. Everything you do with your money in a capitalist society or a neoliberal society, you do with your time. And when you find yourself having to factor in time to be with God in much the busyness of your life, then you know there may be something that's not quite right with the way that you're using time. Because time is made for the purposes of love.
Mm.
And if the way that you're using your time is not for the purposes of love, then have a think about it.
Mm.
I had this conversation with one of my good friends who works in a busy hospital in North Carolina, Duke. And he said, well, this place makes me walk at 9 miles an hour minimum. And I said to him, well, if Jesus is walking at 3 miles an hour and you're walking at 9 miles an hour, then who's following who?
Mm.
So it's not to say that there's certain situations where you have to move quickly. You know, if if you're walking your kid down the road and he runs into the middle of the road, you know it's going to saunter over
Mm.
and wait for the car to stop on its own. So speed is important as well, but for the most part, to recognise the people who are or who are not noticed in mainstream timekeeping, you have
Mm.
to be slow, and that's the discipline.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's Chronos versus Kairos, right?
Exactly.
Right. I mean, the capitalist neoliberal way is Chronos, one thing after another, get the most out of your time, and you're pushing for the fullness of time
Just
and rest
enjoy it.
within it,
Yeah.
settle into it, right?
Rest.
I mean, we have all the time in the world. Because last
Correct.
time I checked, Jesus said it is finished from the cross,
Pleasure.
and the from there it's discovering what that means within time and whatever space we happen to
Right.
be in.
And you have to work out. I mean, the reality is that we all do live busy lives, and this is almost
Hmm.
inevitable. But there has to be a stillness in the midst of that busyness that calls us back and we can return to. If we're just constantly moving forward and we get sick.
Okay, last question. Postcards from Aberdeen. You talk
Oh
about
yeah,
Aberdeen being beautiful when it rains, and having
correct.
lived there for 4 years, in the wintertime when it gets dark at 2 p.m. and the city is made of granite and it
Yeah,
rains,
can't
I
beat it.
struggle to see the beauty, John. So can you explain what's going on there?
Well, uh, Aberdeen is called the Silver City by the Great North Sea. And the reason for that is because it's made of granite. At least the old part of the city is made of granite. And granite looks, we have a word here called dreich.
Yep.
Granite looks just kind of depressing and dreich. I don't know how you would translate that word, but it's just a great word. And when it rains, it just seems to get worse. But when the sun shines after the rain and hits the granite, it shines like silver.
Mm.
And so it's beautiful after the rain. It may not be beautiful during the rain, but after the rain, when the sun shines, it's beautiful. And that's why it's called the Silver City.
Right. Well, there you go. I mean, that gives an eschatological sort of perspective to the beauty of the rain because you're anticipating the
That's right.
silver and the sunshine that's coming.
Yeah,
And
that's too theological for me. I just,
you should
I
have you
just
should have taken that one. You should have claimed it. You're like, that's exactly what I was going for. It was an eschatologically charged lyric.
no, it was more of an architectural aesthetic thing.
Yeah, that as well. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time, John.
No,
I
pleasure,
really
pleasure to speak to
appreciate it. And yeah, thanks for the work that you do, both in your writing, your speaking, your music. It's a real gift to me, and I know it's a gift to other people. So thank you.
you. It's kind of you.